Okay, great. We got a bonus one. Thank you very much. Amen. What do you say, church? Amen. Amen. One day I will play with them, if they let me. Thank you. So, we are so versatile here at the Church of the Oranges. We're going to have and in promoting, so this was also to promote the Music Academy. So parents, we have a music academy right here at the church. Remember to enroll your children so that they can play music and they can play one of these instruments one day. We will invite our young ladies from Lake Nelson Academy to come and present us with one selection, and then we will turn it over to Dr. Greaves. Put your hands together. Let us welcome the young ladies from Lake Nelson Academy.
Happy Sabbath, church. Happy Sabbath. Great to be in the house of the Lord. Amen. Amen. I hope that you are blessed.
I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord which made heaven and earth. He said, He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. The Lord which keepeth thee, He will not slumber nor sleep. Oh, the Lord is thy keeper, the Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand, upon thy right hand. No, the sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. He shall preserve thy soul, even forevermore. My help, my help, my help, all of my help cometh from the Lord. My help, my help, my help, all of my help cometh from the Lord. I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from which cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord which made heaven and earth. He said, He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. The Lord which keepeth thee, He will not slumber nor sleep. Oh, the Lord is thy keeper, the Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand, upon thy right hand. No, the sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. He shall preserve thy soul, even forevermore. My help, my help, my help, all of my help cometh from the Lord. My help, my help, my help, all of my help cometh from the Lord.
Okay, we're ready to start. Thank you for coming back. This is a topic that is somewhat taboo, but the education committee seems to like to give me these taboo topics. Last year we did sex, gender, homosexuality, or something in the church. So this year we're talking about mental illness within the church, Christian and mental illness. So the format that I'm going to use is this. There are two panelists. One is here, one is on the way, Pastor Firm, who spoke this morning. I'm going to do a short PowerPoint presentation. Then there's some selected video clips that I'm going to show you. I'll have the panelists respond, and then I'll open to the audience, and that's how we do it. It's going to take us a while. You can leave whenever you want, but we think this is important to get across to the church community. And if you saw the promotion for this program, it says, the Christian and mental illness, down with the stigma, down with the shame, and down with the silence. So we want to open this up. All right, let's go ahead with the next slide, please, Rollo. Right, so first of all, we want to level set what is mental health and what is mental illness. So this first slide gives you an idea. When we talk about mental health, we're talking about a person who is able to cope with the normal stresses of life and carry out the usual activities of daily living without decompensating. When we talk about, the next slide please, when we talk about mental illness, we're now talking about a situation where as individuals, all of us experience problems from day to day, ups and downs and so on, stress, grief, other emotions. But with mental illness, these are more severe and prolonged and often not related to anything externally in terms of our daily life. But the difference here is that whatever is happening interferes with our ability to function normally. So there's a thin line sometimes. But with mental health, you can cope, and basically with mental illness, you have difficulty coping. And there are different degrees of not being able to cope. And as you can see, the last bullet says most mental problems involve all three areas: thinking, feelings, behavior. Next slide. And this sums it up. So mental health problems tend to fall into three categories: the way we think, or the way we feel, or the way we behave. And sometimes there's overlap, as you'll see. But just think of those three categories for that to help you understand. Basically, your thoughts are messed up, your feelings or your mood is messed up, or your behavior is in trouble. Next slide. So this just shows you that 1 in 5 American adults will have a diagnosis of a mental health condition in any given year. 50% of Americans will meet the criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition sometime in their life. And half of those people will develop a condition by the age of 14. Lots of mental illnesses begin early, and typically between 14 and 24, 75% of the mental illnesses that we encounter will be diagnosed. Next slide. So here are some symptoms and warning signs. This is not all inclusive, there are many others, but these are the major ones. And it says here, when people first begin to experience symptoms of a mental health condition, they shouldn't be ignored or brushed aside, hoping they'll go away. Like other health conditions, we need to address the symptoms early, identify the underlying disease, and plan an appropriate course of action or path towards overall health. The common symptoms that we find are things like too much sleep, or the opposite, trouble sleeping, trouble focusing or having racing thoughts, changes in appetite, could be too much or too little, isolating yourself from others or losing interest in things you once enjoyed, and just irritability or having a short temper. Next slide. What causes mental illness? We aren't totally sure. In some cases, it appears that there's a genetic component. There are conditions like one we'll get to call bipolar disorder that seems to be definitely genetically transmitted to some extent, and to a lesser extent some of the others. Then there is a biology. It is thought, although this theory is changing, that an imbalance in the neurotransmitters in the brain may be responsible for some mental illnesses. Some think it's an imbalance between serotonin and melatonin, or serotonin and dopamine. But the latest theory is that it's not just an imbalance in the neurotransmitters, but it's more problems with the transmission across the synapses of the neurons in the brain. But we won't go into detail. Then there are some things that are triggered by environmental stresses, trauma, sudden loss, violence, and so on. We'll get that later on. And then there are things like lifestyle, poor diet, substance abuse, lack of exercise, irregular sleep patterns, and there are actually some drugs that can sometimes lead to mental problems, like high doses of steroids can sometimes do this. All right, next slide. So here's one framework to think of mental illness in these terms. Broadly, we sometimes categorize mental disorders as being psychoses or neuroses. And the big difference is that for neurotic conditions, these often represent an extreme form of normal emotional experiences. And there are a whole bunch of neuroses that we won't get into, like obsessive compulsive disorders, phobias, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and so on. But under the psychosis, these are the more severe mental problems. And psychotic conditions interfere with a person's perception of reality and are associated with impairment of judgment and thoughts and in reasoning. And here is where we find things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Next slide. Another way to categorize the mental illnesses is like this. And there are 5 major categories. Far over on the left are the anxiety disorders, then there are the mood disorders, schizophrenia, other psychotic disorders are in the middle, then there's dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's or not, and then there are the eating disorders that we alluded to. Just want to give you a flavor without going into details. Remember, our goal here is to really more share some information, have you to become aware. We're not trying to help you go diagnose yourself or anybody else, and we're not trying to give you medical information to go treat yourself, all right? Just that's a disclaimer. This is purely educational. Next slide. Okay. Look at this slide for a second. You must have read this story in the Bible, right? People tend to associate mental illness with being crazy. Mental illness doesn't mean that person's crazy. There's an extreme form of behavior when a person's psychotic where they do things that might be considered quote-unquote crazy. But that's not the whole universe of things. This story in the Bible is very interesting when Nebuchadnezzar. And the interesting thing in verse 34, this is the 7-year period, remember, when Nebuchadnezzar was sent out to crawl on its floors and so on. But verse 34 says, at the end of that time, it was 7 years, it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. So the implication is that Nebuchadnezzar was insane, quote-unquote, mad, if you will. I just want to share that with you just to keep on the back burner. I'm not going to focus on this, but just to help you recognize that there are some disorders that are really very extreme. And I don't know if this is really schizophrenia or not, but this is a very extreme example in the Bible. Next slide. Question for you to think about before I come back to open up the audience. Is mental illness a form of demon possession? There are some people who believe this. I'm curious to hear what you have to say later on. But the next slide. Next slide. Guys? Okay. I want to go to a video clip. I want you to listen to this. This is a trained psychiatrist who, in essence, summarizes what we know about schizophrenia. So I want to share this with you because this is like the
Schizophrenia is the most serious disorder that we have in psychiatry. It's much more than hallucinations. It's an illness where the person's main problem is being psychotic. With psychosis, you're not able to tell what's real and what's not real. You can have psychotic symptoms like hallucinations for different reasons, like having a reaction to a steroid medication, just as an example. But with schizophrenia, there are several symptoms. You have to have 2 of the 5 psychotic symptoms. Delusions, which are fixed false beliefs, and the person cannot be convinced that they're wrong. And this is more than believing you're the best at soccer, because that's subjective. This would be something like your spouse was duplicated from a skin tag taken from the outer quadrant of your calf. Hallucinations. These can affect any of your 5 senses. The more common hallucinations, though, are auditory, which are hearing things that aren't there, and visual, which are seeing things that aren't there. One important thing to remember is these hallucinations happen when you're completely alert, awake, and clear. This does not include hallucinations that anyone can have when you're falling asleep or waking up. Disorganized thinking. We call this a formal thought disorder. This is usually something that other people notice by the way you talk. You may answer questions in a way that's only slightly related to what the person said, and it makes sense in your mind, but the person listening isn't quite sure what you mean. A 4th symptom of schizophrenia is disorganized behavior. And this is more than having a junkie room. This is major levels of internal disorganization that get in the way of daily functioning. I've seen people who are so impaired that they smear feces on the wall. Another way it can look is the person has outbursts of agitation. Sometimes it can be outbursts of laughing for seemingly no reason. And this is not because you're thinking about a funny video you've watched. You may be thinking, might not be thinking about anything, and may even feel like your head is completely empty, but you're laughing and disturbing people. The last manifestation of schizophrenia is negative symptoms, and this is not as easy to recognize or understand. The first 4 symptoms that I mentioned are called positive symptoms. The best way to think about the negative symptoms is you're not responding to your environment in the usual expected way. And it's usually not something that you notice about yourself. What other people will notice is they'll see dramatically decreased facial expressions, or complete lack of eye contact, or failure to initiate movement or speech. So you may sit in a room with very little stimulation around you, doing nothing. So those are the 5 symptoms, and you must have 2 of them going on at the same time for at least a month. And these symptoms cause serious problems in your social life, work, academic life, or family life. So I don't want you to think, I heard someone call my name last week. Does that mean I'm schizophrenic? No, not from that one symptom alone. In fact, schizophrenia is so disabling, you shouldn't need to think hard to find 2 of these things that you did sometime in the past and question if you have schizophrenia. A couple of features that go along with this is lack of insight and cognitive problems. When you're delusional, you don't know that you're delusional. It's real to you. You only realize it's a delusion after the symptoms have passed. And they don't pass in a couple of hours, at least not when it's from schizophrenia. When it comes to the hallucinations, some people can experience continual voices talking in the background that they're able to ignore, as long as their ability to ignore it depends on the volume of the voices and what they're saying. So there's a lot that goes into establishing this as a diagnosis, and there's lots of nuances here, as you can probably see. But this information is not so that you can diagnose yourself, it's just so that you can have more information to understand your illness once you have already been diagnosed. We don't know exactly what causes schizophrenia. It can be inherited and run in families, and there have been associations linked between birth complications and older paternal age. But we don't have a strong enough link to establish these things as causes. It tends to show up somewhere between late teens and early 30s, but the peak age of onset is early 20s for men and late 20s for women. We treat schizophrenia with antipsychotic medications. The goal is a complete resolution of symptoms, but that usually doesn't happen, especially when you consider the hit that it takes on your thinking abilities. The medications help keep the positive symptoms like the delusions and the hallucinations under control.
Good, thanks. So we're going to pause here. I'm going to invite our panelists to come up, Pastor Furman and Fordham and what's it? And while you're thinking about the video, I'm going to ask them their thoughts as well. You can sit over here. So I'll introduce Melissa first and then have her say a little more of herself. So she's a RN-BSN trained nurse, worked in the psychiatric field for decades, has extensive experience working in the mental health field, also has personal experience having suffered with some illness at one point, and she will tell us a bit about that as we go on. And before I come to Pastor Fordham, do you want to say a few more words about your experience? Because I'm just touching the headlights.
Hello, everyone. My personal experience with mental illness, as you saw earlier, came from both biology and environmental. Biology was based, I've had my tubes tie after I had my daughter.
But Melissa, I don't want to go into all of your
No,
personal, just
not
to
all
give
of
them
it.
your experience for now. We'll come back to your details
Yeah,
later. Go ahead.
With that, I started having the changes, in thought and behavior. But as far as my experience goes in the mental illness department, I started as a direct care worker in Massachusetts. I worked with boys ages from 6 to 13. These were children that their parents had relinquished their parental rights. They were kids the parents didn't want anymore because of behavioral issues, so they would drop them off at residential facilities. Our goal was to help these kids relearn proper behavior, but they also some of them had psychiatric symptoms, and a lot of them, because you can't diagnose a child with schizophrenia or any major mental illness, we had to wait when they turn teenagers. Then here, when I moved here in New Jersey, I started working on a detox unit. This is a bit tough for a lot of people to know because you don't know how many people suffer with substance abuse issues until you work in a facility like that. I've seen nurses, pastors, teachers, lawyers, you name it. They all come in, and it's something that they don't want their families to know about. And a lot of times I've had high school students who could not graduate high school until they completed a detox protocol. I've also worked with children at that same hospital over at Summit. I also worked in the community for Bridgeway Services. What we do, since most of you are in New Jersey probably, we have state hospitals. We have Ancora, Ankline, which is for people with like severe assault charges, Trenton Side, Greystone, Hagerdon got close, but the main psych hospitals, we take patients out of there. So these patients have been hospitalized sometimes for like 2 years, 6 years. So what we do at the PAC team, we would rehabilitate them within the community. This is when they get Social Security benefits. The state gives us money to find an apartment for them, buy new furniture. My job as a nurse is to provide medication education and also take them food shopping to teach them how to shop appropriately, because a lot of times patients or clients with mental illness, they have medical problems such as hypertension, diabetes, and a lot of times when they start decompensating, when you start seeing those negative or positive symptoms, they stop taking their medication, and this is where, we come in. Now I work at Newton Medical Center in St. Clair's, voluntary and involuntary unit, so this is what I do.
All right, good, thanks. We'll come back to some of that. Now, you heard Pastor Fordham introduced this morning, but this man has traveled extensively. He didn't tell us about all of his travels and what he has done. And I'm sure that in your church or churches along the way, you must have had some in your congregation at some point who suffered from mental illness. So we want you on the program because of the nuance that comes up. There is the perception and sometimes the reality that there are members in the church looking for help and they can't get it because their particular church congregation or pastor isn't as attuned to that. So, but do you want to say anything else about your background just to give more perspective, or no?
Sure, you actually are very correct that if you pastor for any portion of time, you will probably come across someone who's struggling with some mental challenges. And one of the difficulties from a pastoral perspective is we're not clinically trained to be able to even assess, and definitely not to engage. And one of the benefits that I happen to have now is we have an associate who is a trained psychologist who does the majority of our family counseling, so that when I come across individuals who are showing some challenges that seem to be beyond what I may be adept at dealing with, I'm able to refer to this gentleman who has both the pastoral skills and the therapy skills.
You're way ahead of most churches then. You're way ahead.
We consider ourselves blessed. The individual was an ordained minister, left or paused because he felt the need to go back to school for some therapy skills. He felt like he was limited in just praying for people. And then after he came back with those skills, he felt he was on the opposite extreme where he's practicing, but he couldn't pray with people. And he was our first elder. We ended up becoming our associate pastor, and now he can blend the both. He can do therapy and can do spiritual intervention.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have a lot to cover. So this is just the first video. There are 3 more to go. I just want to give you a chance to add anything you want, questions about the video. I just say to you that, I mean, most of you know me. My background is internal medicine and research and ID and so on. But for 3 summers before medical school, I worked in a psychiatric hospital. And I did in the summer, the first year of medical school. And I gained so much experience, and so many experiences I could tell you about that would probably raise your hair, because I worked in a locked ward. These are the most severe psychiatric patients, schizophrenics, manic depressives, and so on. But we'll probably get to some of that along the way. I just tell you one experience that I had actually in one of our churches before moving to New Jersey. There was a young woman, extremely good, bright student, in her final year, and then she just flipped out. What we would typically call a nervous breakdown, when she just couldn't cope. The mother found her in her house, crawled under the bed, and she was convinced that someone was in the house with a gun trying to shoot her, so she wouldn't come up from under the bed. Finally, we were able to get her out of the bed, got her to see a family doctor, and here's the other thing we'll say. Just because you love your doctor, and your doctor is a good family doctor, doesn't make that person skilled enough to handle a mental illness. So for about a month, this young girl was not properly treated. One of her relatives came by to visit and said, no, you need to go see, actually it's a psychiatrist in this case. Bottom line, she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Had to be treated for quite a while, and she responded very well. She was actually able to graduate, move on, and they left the area and went to another state. Did well for a while. As with some medications, there are side effects. She gained a lot of weight. She didn't like it. She stopped taking medications, would say she's not taking it. She relapsed. Bad relapse. Had to be hospitalized for some time. And along the start of the story now is like maybe 20 years ago now, she was able to come back to function somewhat, but has still had difficulty holding down jobs in the between time. I mean, and this was a promising young student. I'm just saying. You heard from the psychiatrist, it can start pretty early. And sometimes there's no rhyme or reason. There was no family history in her case. So I say this to help you keep an open mind and be compassionate as well, because you don't know what can happen. That's what I want to say for this point. I'll take a few questions from you, and then we'll go to the next level. Yes?
So I had a friend who showed a couple of different personalities. I'd say 2 personalities. What we knew him as, but then he would have this very sassy attitude, and we thought it was just part of him. So this is a question about multiple personality disorder. I know it's a clinical disorder, but then the spiritual aspect as well is what my question is tailored to. So a couple of months ago, we were in a service, and there was a pastor there that kind of just stood in the authority of God with dominion over the spirit, and my friend manifested like he had a demonic kind of stronghold over him, and this personality that came out was actually that demon that was wrestling with the pastor and things like that. So that showed us all that time we had been dealing with that personality was not actually him. But then I don't doubt that in psychology there's, and he was delivered, praise God, that is kind of the end of the story. He was delivered from that. But I don't doubt at all that there's multiple personality disorder. So my question is, how do you as a pastor or as a clinical psychologist know when something, and you're both, Christians, how do you know when something is demonic possession or a stronghold that needs to be, a deliverance needs to take place, or it's clinical? Like, how do you know the difference?
Okay. All right, so that was a question that was going to come out later on in the series of the slides, but we'll take it now. So that is a good question because it comes up, and in fact, in preparing for this, I spoke to 2 pastors about their thoughts on this because there are some church members who believe that mental illness is all spiritual and that's all demonic. I'll give you my perspective, I'll have the pastor give his, and I'll listen. Before we ignore treating what could be a medical illness, I'll say get it checked out first. It may be as simple as something as hyperthyroidism causing your bad behavior. It could be, we mentioned some of the things already. Haven't ruled everything out. That's the way I would go. Now, a pastor might take the other approach. He may start at the spiritual and not get to the medical. This is just my bias as a physician. I think that there's danger in just writing things off and saying they're spiritual. I'm not denying the fact that the earth is the devil's playground, and he's allowed to do a lot of stuff. I don't disbelieve that there are demonic possessions, but I'm not willing to say that mental illness is a demonic possession. I think demonic possession can take the form of a mental illness, but I don't equate them as being equivalent. I'll leave you for last. I'll hear Melissa first. What's your thought on that?
From a clinical perspective, if a patient were to present at the hospital with extreme strength and we had to call security to restrain them, or they sprouting out anything that's of any religious content, I can't put down on a paper, clinically speaking, that this patient is demon possessed, because the psychiatrist might look at me and say, well, then you need to be in here as well. What we do take into consideration is we do a full assessment on the patient. Spiritual assessment, because a lot of times you have people who are in Satanism, as Dr. Greaves mentioned, the devil is real and he does whatever he's going to be doing. And you have some people who do things, ingest things, and smoke things, and next thing you have a completely different person in front of you. I'm sorry? Yes, there's K2. There's also substances that what we call substance-induced psychosis. The person presents the same way. What we're finding out is that the marijuana that's on the street, because I do get patients from the jail, those are drug dealers, and what they do let us know is that they spray that with roach spray. So whatever's out there there's something mixed in it. It's never anything pure. It's always laced with something. And whatever it is laced with, that will, the person will exhibit certain behaviors. And lastly, I think it has to do with the medical component. If you have any medical problems that you're not paying attention to, like a lupus flare-up, you can develop psychotic behaviors.
Pastor?
I think there are 2 extremes. You alluded to alluded to it a little bit earlier. I think one extreme would be the way that your environment would assess you if you implied that someone was demon possessed. One extreme is to say that does not exist. And Satan would love for us to fall on that extreme. You would have to throw out almost the entire book of Mark if you concluded that demons do not exist. Jesus repeatedly was casting out demons. But then I think there's an opposite extreme where any and every manifestation of abnormalcy is written up as demon possession. Someone is coughing, they have the demon of a cold.
Yeah.
That's an opposite extreme. I think one way to potentially gather which side we're falling on, Jesus dealt with an individual when he came down off of the Mount of Transfiguration. The disciples wondered why they could not cast out this demon who was controlling this father's son. And Jesus said, this kind comes out only by prayer and fasting, which means if we can find some medication, that wasn't a demon.
Right.
Because then I now, by my medical prowess, have become, the caster out of demons in and of myself. If there is something that can be handled by medical intervention, that wouldn't be a demon, or else you could medicinally save yourself from sin.
Yeah. Okay, that's well put. I like that. Hope that helps. And the other thing that I would say is that when you find supernatural types of behavior, like for instance, somebody comes floating in here, not even walking on the ground, gets towards me, just knocks me against the wall, that is totally not normal behavior. That's in the supernatural realm. So you have to accept that is demonic. You have to think, it is supernatural expressions of behavior. Things like levitation and so on. No, not going there. All right, let's get back to the slides so we can move ahead. Rollo? Media. Right, okay, so I want to turn now to depression for a little bit because this is actually much more common. Schizophrenia is not that common, but it's very severe. But good thing it's not common. Let's talk about depression, a lot more common. And this is not just simple depression. We're talking about clinical depression, which is more than just a passing bout of sadness or dejection or feeling down the dumps. It can be a major debilitating illness that can sap the joy of life and be associated with extreme sadness, loss of concentration, loss of energy, appetite, sleep problems, irritability, feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, anger, and guilt. Next slide. Now, there was a time when we used to talk about in medicine reactive depression and endogenous depression. And reactive depression was thought to mean depression related to something in your external environment, like these things. And endogenous depression was the kind of depression that just occurred from within for no good reason. Now we've moved away from that paradigm a little bit. I'll come back to it. But what I want to show you here, this has been very well researched by Holmes and Ra, and they've come up with a stress scale. And these are the 10 most stressful life events, at least within the North American context. In the UK, it's slightly different. But you see at the top, death of a spouse, significant trauma psychologically. Divorce, separation, death of a close family member, even retiring. People don't know what they're going to do. They end up being depressed and lost. So this is just to give you an idea of what might be a trigger to depression. Next slide. Depression is in the Bible, all over the Bible. You read the Psalms, you see David in many, many situations. 143 says, there is no place to hide and no one who really cares. 42:5, why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become restless and disturbed within me? Of course, he goes on to talk about hope, but this slide is just to illustrate the depression component. Elijah, after that tremendous victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah runs from Jezebel like a frightened cat. And then he goes and he hides and says to the Lord, take my life, for I'm not better than my father. It's very suicidal. Job talks about blotting up the day of his birth and the night when his parents created him. Next slide. So bipolar disorder is something you're going to hear about a lot. I just want to touch on it lightly in that there are two parts to it. You can either be at the depressed end of it or at the manic end of it, when you're full of energy, you're happy, everything is high. But when you're depressed, you're really down. This is a very severe illness. When I was in medical school, there was a girl in my class, it's in Montreal, and she came down with bipolar disorder. And she was found one morning about 3 o'clock, walking down the major street in Montreal, St. Catherine Street, freezing cold, all naked. But she was happy and she was fine, as if everything was good. So I'm just saying what can happen. That's one part of it. There are others, when they're in the depressed phase, they don't want to do anything. So the slide on the right hand gives you some of the emotions that a depressed person would often feel, being abandoned, guilty, nervous, helpless, and so on. Next slide. So what I want to do now is just show you another video clip from a young woman, young African-American woman, that illustrates some of what can happen in a period of clinical depression. So let's watch this for a few minutes, and try to see the lessons that we can learn from this.
Hey, this is hard. Let me tell you something about somebody that's depressed. You think, well, why didn't you just ask somebody for help? Why didn't you go to your mom? Why didn't you go to your brother or your sister or your grandma? Because you are embarrassed. You know, you're aware that it's something wrong with you, but to go to somebody and to ask them, you know, tell them, I'm not feeling well. You know, the first thing somebody goes, what's wrong with you? You know, and you try to explain, well, I don't feel good. You know, I feel depressed. Oh, girl, you're just going through something. That's everybody. Everybody goes through that. And so you get embarrassed to tell anybody. And then when you finally tell somebody, if they kind of respond to you like, oh, everybody goes through that. Oh, girl, that ain't nothing. Oh, money don't make you happy. Stuff like that. Things that are meant well, but they're taken as you just dismiss me. It draws you closer into your shell, because you're like, I'm not getting through to anybody. Nobody's taking me seriously. I'm just going to sit here and just deal with it on my own. And that's how I felt. I feel like, you know, when I did try to share it with somebody, they would just think, oh, there's nothing wrong with you. You just stressed out. You just, oh, it's just glass, or it's just this, or it's just that, or, you know, you just got to get over it type thing. And that's almost, besides, won't you go ahead and kill yourself? Get over it is one of the worst things that you can say to somebody that's in that situation. I remember I would purposely do my grocery shopping at night. I would wait till about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and then I would go to the grocery store. I would go then because that's when nobody's there. That's when you don't have to look at people. You know, nobody has to watch you. And I remember one day I wanted to go to church, and I used to go to church by myself. I went purposely pick this church. Thank God, thank you Jesus. I was still going, at least trying to go to church at that point. And all my friends went to this big church. All my friends would go to like this big church, but I picked this smaller church. Just kind of walked in there one day, and I would sit by myself. And I was trying to keep going to that. And I remember one day I was going to church, and I walked out. I walked out of my apartment and could not go. I just couldn't go. And I remember I came in, locked the door, and just kind of like slid down the door and just cried and just sat there on the floor and cried. And I was like, Lord, I can't even go outside no more. Like, just going out the door was too much for me. So it must have been noticeable. And at the time I worked at a nursing college. I wasn't going to school for nursing, but I did work at this college for nursing. And I worked up under the president of the college. And one day she came into my office and she said, Carissa, how have you been? She said, Carissa, how are you? And I said, oh, I'm good. And I remember then she closed the door. She came and she sat down and she said, Carissa, how are you? She said, I want you to tell me the truth, you know, that type of deal. And y'all, I just busted into tears. And I was just telling her everything. I was telling her stuff I had told nobody. And I just told her how unhappy I was and how I just felt like I just wasn't myself anymore. And I don't even know how to get back to me anymore. And she said, well, honey, I know you have insurance. You know, why haven't you taken advantage of your mental health benefits? And that just made me boo-hoo even more, because the truth of the matter was that I had thought about it. And, but the problem was that I had a $200 deductible. And I had to pay that deductible before I could take advantage of any of my benefits. And how many of y'all know that when you ain't got $200 is like unfathomable. And I was extremely embarrassed. I was so embarrassed to tell her that. And I just told her, I said, I don't have the money. I was telling her basically, I don't have $200 to even pay my deductible. And she looked at me and she said, it's $200? And I said, yes. And I will never forget this moment as long as I live. I remember it like it was yesterday. This woman, who was the president of the college, reached over into her Coach bag, pulled out her Coach wallet, opened it up, and wrote me a check for $200. And she did it without even thinking about it. It wasn't like she was sitting there trying to decide. It wasn't like she was trying to debate about it at all. She did it like it was a reflex. She went into her purse and wrote me a check for $200 and handed it to me and said, I want you to make an appointment today. And that woman changed my life at that very moment. And I know this sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. And I want to stop here and say, you don't ever know what's nothing to you that means everything to somebody else. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You truly saved my life. And I will forever appreciate you, forever. Angel on earth, I swear, like, God really does have angels walking around among us. So anyway, fast forward. And I made my appointment. I actually ended up with a very, very, very good psychologist. And we went through a process. And I want to stop there. So yes, I had to go get help. And I really wanted to just make this video to bring awareness to it, because especially in the Black community.
So you heard her experience. I hope you're not sleeping in the back. She says several lessons from that. One is that God has angels on earth. Would you have taken out your wallet and written her $200 right there and then? Think about it. But let's get your reactions first before I go to the audience. Melissa? Keep it short, but yeah, go ahead.
The young lady is right. A lot of us,
You want to hold the mic a little closer to you?
sorry,
Yeah.
a lot of us when we're suffering or dealing with a depressive state and we confide in somebody, we get dismissed. It does happen, and when that happens, whoever is in that spot is not interested in seeking treatment, is not interested in talking to anybody, and will avoid anybody at all costs. I have seen it, and that is why we strongly encourage, church folks, if you see someone sitting by themselves, if they normally don't do that, quietly reach out to the person. You don't have to make an overt, sign of it, but they would prefer that privacy, because it's still a stigma. Mental illness is still a stigma, no matter how we talk about it, and no matter how we go about it. We still get embarrassed when we have to confide into somebody to say, I can't handle this right now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Let me see.
How then, so I do go to that person and we may have a brief conversation and they tell me everything that's going on with them. What is my next step to help them? Where do I go from there?
Yeah, so before I come back, Melissa, you see what the lady did in that program? She said, I want you to go get help. So that's the good thing you can say.
So the direction then is to not for me to take the next step, but for me to nudge them to do to take the next step?
I think you can assist a person, because even though there's so many different resources out there, unfortunately, you would be surprised to know how many people don't know how to reach out for help. I mean, the Department of Health itself provides a list of phone numbers, community service, like rehab centers, or because a lot of places don't take insurance, unfortunately, and you have to pay out of pocket, and nobody has like $160 to pay a therapist, for an hour, if you're gonna be there for 2 hours or twice a week, depending on what's going on with you. I think the best part is to offer the person, would you like me to help looking for assistance? Do you need my help? Like if you can't tolerate that, if you can't manage it, because a lot of times you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but by reaching out to this person and say, look, I'm here for you, and say that this is confidential. I'm not gonna go and talk, about it to my best friend, and please make sure that you actually do that, because our initial urge when something like this happens is to pick up the phone. Guess what just happened? I just spoke with this person. This is what they're going through. There you go. So now this person's business is all over the place. So instead of you helping, you're causing harm. So if you can keep it to yourself and say, I'm going to go there with you. I'm going to go to these places. NJHelp.org has a list of places. NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, list of resources where anybody can go just to talk to somebody.
So we have a slide at the end that gives a list of resources. But just to keep things moving, I'd say helping with money is one thing, but they may even need physical help. You may want to offer to drive them to the psychiatrist even. So you can think of ways that you may be able to ask them. But I like what she says, well, they like to be asked permission. Is it $200 you need? Just to double check. Would you like me to go with you? Whatever. But, try to be empathetic, Martha.
I just want to elaborate on what you just said. Both of you said it in terms of providing assistance for individuals. Many organizations or healthcare organizations now are looking for these faith-based places, or churches more specifically, to provide services that hospitals cannot provide, they do not provide. So they reach out to churches for individuals who are willing. Are you willing to donate an hour, 2 hours to talk to somebody, to help somebody do something, to call somewhere on the phone and help them get the assistance that they can get? Oftentimes, there's not enough opportunities for these folks to even get the help. It can be so close, but they don't have the strength. They don't have the stamina to even get the help. So if those of us who can assist would make ourselves available 1 hour, 2 hours a week to reach out and help, you have no idea how far that can go. Very, very far, and will help us and others.
So I want to emphasize one thing that we alluded to. You know, when a person is really, really in a clinical depression, they're often bereft of any energy. Even to pick up the phone, to make that phone call, you may give them the number, they just don't have the mental energy to do it. I've seen that. Or even to shower, they'd rather stay in bed all day. So if you've never had any close contact with a person who's really in clinical depression, you may not appreciate what I'm saying. But once you do, you will appreciate what I'm telling you. Just a few days ago, one of my friends called me and said, you know, my daughter's getting married. Everything just seems out of control. I'm just feeling overwhelmed. So I was trying to suggest taking one step at a time. He says, yeah, but you know, even one step at a time is so much for me to do right now. And that's the difference between mental health and mental illness. We started by saying, when you're mentally healthy, you can cope with the normal stresses of daily life. But when you slide over to the other side, even the slightest thing is a big, big deal. I want to move a little further with the question. Caroline, go ahead.
I agree with everything. I was looking at the slide with the steps, the different types of losses, and I think it's important that we recognize when someone has experienced one of those, we need to be watching them.
Good point.
Because
can you go back to that slide?
It is, yes. If we, yeah, that slide is important. We know that when you lose someone in death, that person's going to go through a lot. But the others we don't really pay close attention to. And it is important that if you have a loved one that has gone through or that is going through one of those, the one with the step ladder.
Further back up, near the beginning. The other way, the other way, the other way. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Yep, the stairs, yep.
Okay. It's important that we recognize if somebody's going through, we need to have our eyes on them. I am not embarrassed anymore. I used to be, but I was diagnosed with clinical depression, major depressive disorder, and it was situational based on trauma that I went through. And if I didn't have friends that knew who I was before the trauma, no one would have recognized the different person. So they noticed the shift. And everything that young lady said happened to me. I couldn't even go to church. So I found churches where no one knew me, so I never had to look in anyone's eyes. I knew it was really bad when I was at work and I couldn't make eye contact with anyone. And depression is like a black hole, and the sides are very slippery. And if you don't get help early, you'll keep slipping into a darker place. And the signs are very subtle in the beginning. In the beginning, you could just be like, well, your friends are going out. I'm not going to go out with you guys this time. And then that just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I don't want to hold it up, but everything that she said.
No, that's important. That's important. I mean, you're speaking from experience, and this is very brave of you, and I appreciate the fact that you're so willing to be open and share. This is critical, because this is not theory. This is what she's experienced. And some of us are so like the Pharisees. If it hasn't affected us, we don't think it exists. So that's the whole reason we're having this program, to get people to understand that there's a reality you may not know yourself, but it exists for some people, and it's very, very real. And as Christians, we need to understand that we have a role to be compassionate and to reach out to others. So that's where we're going with the program. So this is good. Appreciate that. Do you want to add anything else from your own experience as well, or are you okay to move ahead?
It's just that when you're in that dark hole, your spirituality is at stake in a sense that you kind of lose sight of God a bit. It's hard for you to pray. It's hard for you to even get on your knees and say anything, because at that time, not only you don't want to talk to an actual human being, but you don't want to talk to your Father in heaven either. You don't want to do anything. No shower, no brushing your teeth, no nothing. And you feel comfortable there. You're so comfortable that if somebody were to come at your door and say, look, I'm taking you to get help, you're not going to want to go. You're not going to want to go, because this thing is so powerful over you that it's, as the pastor was saying, you know, like it's almost like demon possession you would compare it to, but it's not easy. It's not easy for anybody who's truly suffering from a depressive state to come out of it. And it's good to pray for the person, but just know that it's an uphill battle that you have.
Thank you. The young lady said that she would be in a house. Her friends would come knock on her door. She wouldn't answer. So it distorts your whole perception of friendship and everything else. All right, let's go a little further. I want to talk now about another taboo subject, and then show you another video. This is suicide. It's funny how things work. With the opioid epidemic, there are tons of suicides now occurring in the United States. You know that, right? And it's so bad. It is bad. But what happened a decade or two ago when it was affecting the black community? Excuse me? All of a sudden, it's a different population, and it's the opioid epidemic. It's a problem. We have to address it. But when this was destroying the black community years ago, I can tell you, I was at Howard University in D.C., and we had tons of people with heroin addiction, all kinds of HIV infections as a result. It was no big deal. They need to be in jail. Now we need to treat them nicely, right? It's amazing, the world in which we live. But anyways, suicide is really a big problem. And one of the things that I didn't put here that I'm going to say right now is that there are a number of suicides that are occurring among people who are gay because they feel rejected and disowned by their own families and churches. You guys hear what I'm saying? Last year we talked about this, the fact that in our churches there are people who are gay, and we ignore them or ostracize them or we treat them as if they don't exist. And while it is one thing not to condone a behavior, it is not a good thing to condemn a person. God died for all of us. He didn't die for us so we can go on sinning, but He died for all of us. We need to get beyond the stigma and stop judging people with our eyes because we don't know the motives. But I won't go in more detail about that, but that's one of my little peeves. But anyways, here's a few things that you might know. Suicide is the third leading cause of death for people between the ages of 10 and 24. Did you know that? Did you know this? It is not as uncommon as you think. Women tend to employ different methods when they commit suicide or try to commit suicide. Men tend to use more violent methods, particularly guns, handguns. And so, before I go to the next video clip, I want to ask you a question. I've heard it said in many of our churches that you commit suicide, you commit the unpardonable sin, you're in hell. What do you folks think about that? Is suicide the unpardonable sin? If you say yes, I'm going to ask you another question. Is there any difference between Samson's suicide and that of Judas Iscariot? Just give it some thought. And maybe I shouldn't ask you to declare yourself, but just to think about it. I asked one of my friends who was a pastor in preparing for this, and he smiled when I asked him. And then he tried to cop out on me by saying, but was Samson's really a suicide? I said, what do you mean? He knew he was going to die. you were saying he did it because he was trying to kill us. I said, yeah, true, but he knew he was going to die. So are we drawing little lines in the sand here or what? So in the end, he said, well, you know, to tell you the truth, I don't know. Because I kept pushing him, do you think Samson will be saved? Do you think Judas will be saved? I said, suppose Judas, for all we like to write him off as being no good, and he was no good, whatever, how do you know that in a few seconds before he left this world, that he utterly realized how stupid he was and said, God, I don't know what you think, Pastor. I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
There are a few things that I think, and I want to stay within the constraints that you imagine to respond. I think one aspect of this question is our understanding of salvation. If we believe that salvation is gained or lost each time that we sin and confess, then we might think that suicide is an unpardonable sin that results in us being lost because I may not have gotten an opportunity to confess. The Bible actually says that there is a sin that's not unto death. There is the reality that we have already been saved and that our sins do not snatch us away from that salvation, regardless of if it is a sin like suicide. The Bible describes the unpardonable sin in one scenario. It's mentioned a couple of times in the Gospels, but it's one chronological scenario. Yes, repeated time. And it is not associated with suicide. It is associated with individuals who are seeing the Spirit move, and they are hardening their hearts, and they are attributing the work of the Spirit in Jesus Christ's life to Satan. And Jesus says, my goodness, if you are going to attribute the obvious moving of the Holy Spirit in my ministry and on your life to Satan, man, what can I even do for you? And that's what he says. Many sins, all sins can be forgiven except the sin against the Holy Ghost. He did not say except suicide. So the unpardonable sin, suicide, those are not equals.
I appreciate that. Good point. And I like also what Mrs. White says, that it is not our individual sins that will prevent me. It's our continual, habitual sinning that really will finally trip us out, not just the individual mistakes that we make. I wanted to share with you briefly an experience that I had, again, during my training. You know, depression is so deadly and so strange. I remember I was doing a period of rotation on a psychiatric ward, short-term psychotherapy, they called it. Excellent, enjoyed it, worked closely with this young woman. I think she was probably about 21. Smart, beautiful, all those things. Seemed to be making progress. So I leave work one evening. I come back to work the next morning, and I hear she's dead. I said, what do you mean she's dead? She was absolutely fine when I left. She had gone to the 17th floor in the hospital and jumped through one of the windows and killed herself. More what a man would do, but she did in this case. And so there are a couple of things that the senior psychiatrist, who was my tutor, pointed out to me. He says, you know, Wayne, a number of people who are in clinical depression, when you think they're getting better because they're beginning to be more open and more active, that's often the time that they will commit suicide. And we see this more in the springtime as well. Other people are now becoming happy, but they just can't feel happy. And so the comparison between where they are and where others are is so vast that they can't handle it. So we can never underestimate what could happen. with someone who's clinically depressed, even when they appear to be getting better, is what I wanted to say. You attest to that?
Yes, usually when a patient, the highest time, risk for suicide is upon admission and at discharge, which is why we always ask patients, do you have anyone? As a matter of fact, there is a law, the NJ Care Act. We are mandated, state laws, to make sure that we identify a caregiver at home, somebody that the person has, whether it's a friend or a family member that we can rely on as far as safety-wise. And also, someone is assigned to call this patient the very next day to check upon them to make sure that they are still alive, especially if they check themselves in for suicide.
So that's good to know. Yes, Devin.
Samson and
Judas.
When I think of suicide, I imagine someone who is depressed, someone who is sad, and someone who thinks that it's just not worth it going on. To carry on. Judas, out of great guilt and shame, felt it wasn't worth his while. And it sounds like what a depressed and sad person would sound like in today's, in a typical suicide that I would read about or see. When it comes to the other character whose eyes were gouged out and a set of people making a whole mockery of his God, I cannot say, even though they both died, the motives were not the same. I am not saying that Samson wasn't depressed or sad because his eyes were gouged out, but the man who betrayed Christ and sold him, his kind of depression and his kind of suicide sounds typical. I am not too sure in today's society, I see a lot of Samson's kind of suicide. And so my conclusion it would be different.
Fair enough.
From a clinical point of view.
Fair enough. But I raise it because I wanted to deal with the issue of, is it okay for us to take our life, whether we do it in the motive of helping others? Like, for example, a lot of the folks who sacrifice themselves in the Muslim community, in Al-Qaeda, for example, they're happy to die. But they know they're killing themselves. They're not mentally in depression. This is their way of seeing the world. I don't have the answer, and that's not the focus of where I'm going, but I appreciate your perspective. But I raise that just to have us think about it because we're sometimes so definitive within the church that suicide is unpardonable. And that's really my issue.
Dr. Reeves, I have a question. Okay. Now, if we're talking about us killing ourselves, let's look at euthanasia. Euthanasia is assisted suicide, and it's usually for people who have chronic illness and terminal illness pretty much, and they can't take treatments anymore, and it's that kind of lifestyle is no longer working for them. How would we address or even treat someone among ourselves who's gone through cancer treatment, is dying, can't take the pain anymore, and is asking to die? Would we condemn this person just because they want to kill themselves? It's illegal in New Jersey, but up north in Maine, it's allowed. So what would be our reaction?
So that's a good question, and I was at Hanson Place Church a few years ago when they had this question about euthanasia and should Adventists practice or condone euthanasia, and the panel was divided, and I suspect in this congregation we'll be divided, but it's a question that comes up, and there was a video, I think a year or so ago, I shared with the Sabbath school class that I'd seen it, where this man just calmly, with his wife, agreed to go through euthanasia and videotaped it. And I'm saying, my goodness, These folks are so happy and ready to do it, had it planned out and everything, and we're so scared to die. You get what I'm saying? Different way of seeing the world, I guess, but they weren't necessarily believers that we are. So I want to show you another video clip. Most of you must have heard, I think, of Saddleback Community Church. In the non-Adventist world, but in the Protestant world, evangelical world, it is a massive unit. It's run by Rick Warren of the famous book, The Purpose-Driven Life, and everything else purpose-driven, and his wife. Saddleback Church. Rick Warren is a very well-known guy, guru to lots of pastors outside the Adventist world, in the evangelical world, and his wife. They've had some real hard knocks. And we're going to share one right now here as you hear from his wife, and she's been interviewed by Sheila Walsh. So let's listen to this interview.
One of the things I love about the book of Psalms is how honest the psalmist David is. Do you ever read them out loud? Sometimes I do. Sometimes if I'm having a really rough day. And I love the fact that he doesn't pretend always to be okay. Even if you look at Psalm 42, he'll say, David, why am I discouraged? Why is my heart so sad? Now he'll go on to say, I will put my hope in God. I will praise him again. But he's saying, you know what? At the moment, that's not where I'm at. I'm really struggling. And I cannot tell you how the Psalms of David have helped me in some of my darkest days. And one of the things that I feel passionately about is to bring that kind of honesty to us in the church when it comes to those who struggle with darkness a lot. We've not always been that great in the church at dealing with mental illness and understanding those who struggle with mental illness. It's hard for me to ask you about the most devastating thing that happened in your life, because I feel as if talking about your son Matthew, I feel like I'm treading on holy ground. But I feel that you have a perspective of, as a mother of a son who struggled with mental illness for some time, can you give us a little perspective of what that journey looks like and feels like?
My Matthew was amazing. But he had mental illness from the time he was very young. He was diagnosed with clinical depression when he was 7, but he could have been diagnosed earlier if we'd known that children can have a mental illness. We didn't know. We just thought he was different than his brother and sister. We thought that the ways that he acted and the ways that he thought that he would outgrow them. We didn't know that he was living with a mental illness from the time he was about 3 or 4. Who knew that children could struggle that young, but he did. And he struggled until the day he died when he was 27, and his illness got worse and worse. He definitely fell into the category of severe mental illness. If I could just digress for a second, sometimes with mental illness, that's what we think of. We think of someone so ill like my son who can't really function in this life. But actually, I have lived with depression my whole life. Not severe depression, but I have depression. Everybody feels anxious sometimes. It's when those things start to cross over and get in the way of normal life. When anxiety and depression, or just you can't cope with friends or work or job, then it starts moving over into mental illness. But even so, that's not that everybody's like my Matthew. But he lived most of his life with a severe mental illness. He started talking about suicide when he was 12. Since he's died, I've found some of his writings where he was actually talking about it sooner, but we didn't know it. One of the worst days of my life was Mother's Day when he was 12, and it had been a hard day. We knew he was depressed. As I kind of tucked him in that night in the dark, I was just kind of prayed with him and was getting ready to walk out the room. And as I started to leave, he said, "Mom, would you kill me and put me out of my misery?" And I was so glad that the room was dark, because he couldn't see my face. And I managed to get through that and say, "Oh, buddy, I'm so sorry that you're feeling so sad. I love you so much." Did my best, walked out of the room. My older son was standing out in the hall, and I collapsed in his arms. And my thought was, no mother should ever hear her child say, "Please kill me on Mother's Day and put me out of my misery." But it was the agony and the torture that he lived with. And of course, doctors, medication, programs, hospitalizations, everything that we knew to do. And yet, by the time Matthew was 27, he didn't really want to die. He just wanted the pain to stop. And as I talk to people, that is what I hear over and over again. I don't really want to die. I just want the pain to stop.
One of the things that I'm so grateful that you and Rick are very much involved in is helping educate the church. Because last year I was speaking in a church and I talked about my father's suicide. And I said, so many people called my father a coward. They don't understand how hard he fought to make it to 33. You know, that's not the act of a coward. That's, I mean, he just come to a place where he couldn't do it anymore.
Makes me mad.
I know,
It makes me mad when people, because it just shows they don't understand.
Yeah.
And I just try to say they don't understand and not stay angry. But when people say that that's a coward's way out, no, I'm sorry, they don't have any idea. That just means you have never walked in despair's shoes.
But the thing that was devastating for me was after I had talked about how I couldn't wait for that day when I'd see my dad again. And at the end, a woman had to practically carry this young woman to talk to me because her dad had committed suicide 6 months before, and the church had told her dad was in hell. And I mean, my heart was just broken for her. And I wanted to find the people who told him that and say, where did you find them?
First I want to pound them, and then I want to show them the verses in Scripture.
So cruel.
Yes, it is.
I've had people say to me, well, Sheila, do you still take medication? I'm like, yes, I do. And I take that pill with a prayer of thanksgiving every day.
Yes, that's
and they're
right.
like, well, don't you believe Jesus can heal you? And I'm like, I absolutely believe he can, and if he will, I'll let you know.
That's right.
And until then, I'll take my pill with a prayer of thanksgiving.
Absolutely. Yeah, that goes to that, you know, still trying to dispel that stigma around mental illness as being something that is your character, or if you just try harder or pray harder, whatever, that it's going to go away. Does Jesus heal instantly? Of course he does. We all know the stories. People who are healed of addiction in an instant. People who are healed of a cancer. Yes, he does it. He doesn't usually choose to do that, though. And so for the rest of us who don't receive that kind of an instantaneous miracle, it doesn't have anything to do with faith. It has to do with God's sovereignty and what he has chosen to do in each person's life. So what I try to tell people is there's not just any one solution or one way to deal with mental illness. We're a whole. God's made us body, soul, and spirit. There's things that have to happen in our minds, things that have to happen in our bodies, and things that have to happen in our emotions to give us the ability to manage a mental illness well. So go to your doctor. Take blood tests, see if there's something that's going on that's causing some of those symptoms. Eat as well as you can, get sleep, exercise, take care of your body. Go and get a diagnosis from a psychiatrist if these things are not helping. See if there's a medication that you might need to be on. Emotionally, you and I all have broken places that we need healing, ways that we've adapted to life. Therapy, counseling, I'm a big believer. I've done my share of it. Relationally, people with mental illness tend to burn bridges with relationships, so there's healing. And spiritually, I mean, draw close to God in intimacy. We are whole beings. And so for mental illness to be managed, all of those things need to transpire.
I think for me, one of the most devastating stories in the New Testament is John the Baptist, and it's the beginning of Matthew 11, when he's sitting in prison. And all he knows that Messiah is supposed to be the one who comes and releases those who sit in prison, and Jesus is not coming. And he sends his disciples and says, you know, you asked Jesus, are you the one?
Oh, so poignant.
Did I get it wrong?
Oh, it's so poignant.
And it's when Jesus says, look, go back and tell John, you know, the blind see, the lame. But then this little phrase, and blessed is he who is not offended by me. Will you love a God who doesn't live up to your expectations, who doesn't answer prayer the way you want prayer answered? Will you worship when nothing makes sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, we prayed for Matthew to be healed. I had to deal with that myself, not only for Matthew's sorrow and struggle, but our sorrow and struggle when he died. Because Sheila, we went out on a limb. I mean, we were so far out on that faith limb that God was I felt like God had given me a word. I had done a fleece, the old Gideon fleece thing, and I felt like God had given me a fleece that he was gonna heal Matthew here. Wow. And when Matthew died, it was crushing. Not only just to lose my son, but to, like John the Baptist, I felt like that same thing. I'm sitting there, wait, you're the releaser of those behind bars. You're the freedom guy. Where was that for Matthew? And to struggle through and to understand as best I can. I have a little mystery pot. I have this little pot where I throw all my questions. It's a little ceramic pot because there's questions that I don't know what to do with. I don't have good answers. What I do know is that I trust God with all that I am. I have more hope than I've ever had. But do I have God figured out? Not in the slightest. So all those questions of why didn't he heal Matthew? Why didn't he answer Matthew's prayer in the way that Matthew prayed? Why didn't he let John the Baptist out of the prison? Why did he let him? I don't know.
Yeah.
But they go in that mystery pot. And I know that when I see Jesus face to face, that those questions, as C.S. Lewis says, will die away in the presence of the answerer himself. I'm holding on to that.
This is tough stuff, guys. Here is a pastor and his wife going through this kind of trauma. She went out on a limb. She believed that her son was going to be saved from this temptation to depression and to suicide. She even tried to fleece. It had positive implications that it would be true. And then it didn't happen. And I can just imagine the whole of Saddleback Church praying for the kid and everything, and then nothing. And then Sheila asked a very pointed question. She says, will you believe in a God when he doesn't answer your prayer the way you expect him to? And then you can go further. Will you believe in a God when the signs that he gave you suggest that he would heal the kid? This is tough stuff, guys. Like she said, she doesn't have any answers. Carlene.
I really just raised my hand in agreement. But the nurse was saying about there are times when you have to push past your faith, even when it doesn't seem like God is there. Because depression can actually make you feel that God left you. One day I was in such a dark place, I heard a voice say to me, God hates you.
God
hates you. Because how could a God that loves me, everything I prayed for, he gave it all to me and then took it all away? And so the reality of what they're talking about how could you worship a God who doesn't answer you the way you thought when you thought he gave you signs that he was saying yes. And that's when we have to push past the feelings and worship him anyway. And that's not easy when you're depressed.
That's not easy even when you're not depressed, furthermore when you're depressed. But I mean, as Christians, we have come to believe that God always wants the best for us. And we can't see around corners, he can. So that keeps us going. But it's still not easy going through that dark tunnel when you're going through the tunnel. And we have to be honest and accept that as fact. Yes, go ahead.
I know we talk a lot about the victim that is may want to commit suicide and all of that. But one of the things that I've observed is those who are left behind to deal with the mourning, the grieving of the loss of someone who may have committed suicide or losing a loved one. And I think that's where we also need some education as well as the body of Christ, because in dramatic situation, persons are quick to come in the immediacy of the situation. Like if it just happened this week, you have the brethren come around and they'll be there this week and next week, and for the month you will see they drop by. And the month passed by, everybody seems to think that everything is well. And a grieving process for an individual can take a year, 2 years, 3 years. Of course, each person really deal with it differently. And so I just want us to be aware as the body of Christ that what about the persons who are left to grieve the loss? Sometimes that kind of depression that can take place in the life of individuals is just overwhelming.
Thank you for that thought. That is tremendously important. And I remember recently discussing this with my wife, with just a regular death. not a suicide. But when there's a death, people are all around. First 4 days, 7 days, then they go back to their homes. I mean, we understand they have to go back to work, but then that individual may be left alone if it was a spouse that died. And unless their family members close by, there may be nothing. Even when they're family members, they're not necessarily responsive. So the church can play an important role, a much bigger role than it sometimes plays. I must say, for this church, I'm impressed by a lot of the things that we do, but your point is very well taken. And grieving can take a while. And the person whose son or daughter commits suicide, the whole family is sometimes ostracized or ignored. Have you noticed that? Oh, well, they had suicide in that family. It's horrible. Comments?
I have this argument, so to speak, with my husband all the time because he looks at suicide, depending on what happened, as an act of selfishness. And I said to him, you know, you can't really look at it as an act of selfishness because the person who committed suicide left loved ones behind to fend for themselves and to figure out how to move on. Just like the brother just mentioned, we need to focus on the family, you know, and whose the suicide happened, because that family and the individuals will need tremendous amount of therapy to let them know, just like we just saw on the video, there is a mental pain that the only relief that that person feels is if I kill myself. If I get rid of myself right now, I won't have to feel the pain. That's because when the person is in so much pain, everything stops existing. So if we focus on the family members to remind them, look, this person was in so much pain, they couldn't think about anybody else, they couldn't think about anything else. Help them understand that and prevent them also from even thinking about it themselves, because once you have a family history of suicide, it's a strong link for later on someone in the family also will have the same symptoms and would want to kill themselves as well. So pay attention to, you know, to that family, pray for them, be there. However way you want to be there, but just be there and not judge the family, not use the word selfishness, because until you've walked into somebody's shoes who's dealing with that kind of pain, you can't stand and say anything about it. You just can't comment about it.
Thank you.
Doctor, I'm not sure why we have a burden as a church or church members to categorize things as that fits in the bad column, this fits in the good column. What are we gaining by painting suicide as evil? Why? Jesus said, I came into the world not to condemn the world. He didn't come and just start identifying all of the evil. Everything is evil. All death is evil. So where's this fixation with needing to bang on the table? That was
selfish or not?
Yeah, I mean, what are we getting from that?
You raise a good point. I hadn't thought of it the way you raise it, but that's a good point you're making. Yeah. What does it get us? Does it make us feel better as a person because I can say you did it because of X or Y? Is like,
yeah. Do we want a fundamental belief that says suicide is evil? What are we getting after?
Yeah. I'll let it permeate in your brains for now.
Pain. There's two things that is actually happening there, because the one who is gone actually leave the one who's alive to grieve, and the one who is gone, the one who's alive, is thinking that you were selfish to just take yourself away from us without giving us any notice. And there's a lot of, in grief, there is so much darkness in grief and confusion that can occur in trying to understand the reason why, even without saying it's suicide, just the natural death create this element of confusion or refusing to let go of the individual. And if it's suicide, just think that it ramps the idea up even more, that the person is now trying to say, how can I justify this act by the individual who commits the act themselves? For the living, the one remain alive, it is even more complicated and more confusing, because now they do not have the person being alive to even
create some kind of resolution or to find
Clarify.
out why did you do it.
Yeah.
And if they know, you don't release the pain, so people speak out of pain.
Yeah. So I think that this is why this kind of discussion is good, to help us understand that even in advance of that happening, not that it will take it away, but your perspective is, I think, right on point. I think what the pastor is also saying is that, yeah, but we should start thinking in a different frame so that if we have to come to that point, we wouldn't then be prone to be thinking like we otherwise would think, well, yeah, you know, this is very selfish because I'm stuck with this now. But that's what happens most of the time. Yes, Valencia. Valencia and then somebody on the far left. Go ahead.
I think this is absolutely a tough conversation to have, but I want to say that I think we're also very selfish ourselves, right? Because I think what we tend to do is we tend to stay in our own space and we don't pay attention to people.
Yep.
Right? We don't pay attention to. We're here,
Yep.
vast, massive church, but we don't pay attention to the person next to us. We sit here and we come, we get whatever we need, and we leave. I think that there's always a sign that there's something going on. There's always, no matter what it is, there's a sign always that something is going on with someone. But the other part of it is, how will you know that something is going on with someone if you don't try to build relationships with them? Right?
Yeah, because there's no reason to talk to you. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that's a problem that we have. We see everything bad that everybody's doing, but we don't tend to build relationships with people to kind of see what's going on with you. Talk to people to see if there's something going on. Just building relationships alone with people will help to alleviate some of the pain that others are feeling, because then they feel that they can confide in someone else. They can talk to someone about what's going on with them. We're talking about suicide, and I looked at the age of 10-year-olds committing suicide, and a part of that is bullying. Bullying is such a major problem nowadays, and I come from not a generation, but a culture in a sense that what do you mean somebody a bully you? What does that mean? So it's like we have to pay attention when our kids say something like, I'm going to kill myself. Take them seriously. Because okay, what do you mean by that? What's going on? So we have to listen when people say things to us. We have to build relationships with people so we can kind of gauge and say, okay, this week you're this way, but this week you're not this way. What's going on?
Which brings me to the importance of the life groups that we're trying to have in the church, the importance of Sabbath school classes, because if you only come to church for the mid-ed service, somebody's talking to you. You don't have any chance to interchange. At least Sabbath school gives you a little bit, the life groups will. And how are you going to build a relationship if it's only one person doing the talking? Think about it. So I think church needs to fundamentally change, in my opinion, if we really are serious about building relationships with each other. And most people, how are you today? Fine, thanks. Are you really fine? Or you're saying fine because you know I don't want to know what you want to tell me, or I don't feel comfortable telling you. So there's a lot of ramifications. You're right, Valencia.
So before I give the mic, let me say this, that we just nailed it on the head. This is exactly why we have programs like this. This is exactly why we knew it's important to start the conversation. Identify where we're weak and where we're strong, where we can help, and what can we do to move it forward. Valencia mentioned building relationships, but very simple. I find that people who complain about lack of sleep usually have some issues that they're dealing with that maybe would need help with. So pay attention to small details. We're talking building relationship. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. That is why we're here. And we find it difficult. We dress nice, we smile and say happy Sabbath, but we have to move away from that. We've been talking about that for so long. We have gotten to the point that as children of God, we need to be intentional about reaching our brothers and sisters and being productive and being meaningful in each other's lives, but not wait for the next Sabbath to again say, Hey, I haven't heard from you all week, Matthew. You look good. You look good next time. But something may be going on.
Yeah.
So let me.
Somebody near the wall had the hand up. Yeah.
Yes, I'm glad that I'm here listening to this topic because I have lived at an apartment where I was sharing with this lady and her son. You know, when I got there, I realized that he was a young guy. He stayed by himself. So one day I asked him, I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Stephanie, I really, you know, I don't know how to tell you, but, you know, I just can't tell you." And he just, you know, he's always by himself. He was always sad. Until every April I remember, it's like it happened. They say, you know, it brings back a big memory to me. One morning I was in my room and I heard his mother call me at the top of her voice. She said, "Stephanie." And she called me 3 times, and the 4th time I got up and I was eating and I put my food down and I went. He was about to jump through the window, 4-story building. And she held him by his foot. All his body was, his head was down. It's only his foot, you remember? And I went there and I helped her to hold him. He comes to church. He was here last week. And I tell you, when that happened, I was there holding him. His head, everything, he stripped his clothes off. He take everything off. He was 20 years old at that time. And I held him, and all I could do was plead the blood of Jesus and crying for mercy. And I tell you, we are at a 4-corner, it's right on Prospect and Park. And I tell you, when I bawled for Jesus, the whole area was blocked off. Police, fire truck, people. And I tell you, he's still alive today. And he goes to churches right now and he tells people that I'm the one who saved his life. Because he said at the time when I was crying for mercy, have mercy, that's my voice he heard, pleading the blood of Jesus. I saw him last Tuesday walking, and he came and he hugged me. He's just live on Center Street right up there. But he's still alive, and I realized he was in hospital for suicidal, but he came out. He's still struggling. He can't even watch TV.
Yeah.
If you look at TV, he said the people trying to attack him on the TV. So he is still suffering with mental problems.
But at least we were able to avert the suicide, so that was a good outcome. I am going to go to the last video clip, and we want to talk a little bit about treatment, but before I go there, there's one slide I want to show you. We talk a lot, not yet, hang on, the slide before that. Yes. So I just want you to be clear that there's a bit of a distinction between what we refer to as counseling and psychotherapy. Counseling typically is a short-term process versus psychotherapy, which is typically longer term. Counseling is more targeted to support the patient, help them perform the day-to-day activities in a normal and efficient manner. Psychotherapy goes deeper. It tries to uncover the basis of the problem and then to address it in the most efficient manner. Counseling tends to address issues, but not in the same depth as psychotherapy does. And counseling really only works with people who are themselves able to think fairly rationally and find the solutions on their own as the counselor interacts with them. Whereas in psychotherapy, the individual is often much more dependent on the therapist to help them gain control over their personality, their mind, emotions, and behavior. So with that, let's go to the last video clip.
My name is Michael, and today I'm going to share my recovery story to instill hope, give encouragement, and inspire those who have a mental illness. Back in 2006, I was diagnosed with bipolar I disorder. I had an 8-month bout with full-blown mania and ended up in a psychiatric hospital. At the end of my stay in that psychiatric hospital, a doctor said to me, "Michael, you have a mental illness. You're going to have it for the rest of your life. You're going to be on medicine for the rest of your life. You will probably go on disability. You will have a hard time working. So for the next year and a half, I saw a psychiatrist 37 times, and he put me on 14 different combinations of medicines. I was on everything from Seroquel to Abilify to Geodon to lithium to Depakote to risperidone. And the psychiatrist never ever mentioned the words hope. He never mentioned the words recovery. He would just change my medicines. Looking back over the last 11 years, I have learned a lot about myself. I have learned a lot about mental illness. And it's kind of interesting. I could have got diagnosed a lot earlier in my life. I got diagnosed when I was 37 years old. And when I was 22 years old, I was in boot camp. And a lot of the stressors in boot camp triggered me to go into mania. And actually, I was diagnosed in boot camp and actually sent home. I was diagnosed with personality disorder. And I didn't realize, I didn't know much about mental illness, and I just kind of ignored it. I just thought to myself, I don't have a personality disorder. So for the next 15 years, I lived with bipolar, undiagnosed bipolar. And that was kind of interesting. My life would have been a lot different if I was diagnosed, at 22. I don't know what it would have looked like. So anyway, looking back over the last 11 years, I've learned a lot. And I'm just going to share some things, some observations, some insights, some opinions that I have about mental illness. I'm not a doctor, but I have read a lot about mental illness, and I've lived with it, and I, of course, still live with it. Now, talking about medications, I really think that medicines affect people differently. I think people, of course, have different body compositions, DNA, chemicals in their brain, different brain composition, and it really affects everybody different. It took me probably 4 years to get the right medicine cocktail. And I really think that people that are struggling with that just need to be patient and need to keep trying and keep trying. Second thing I want to talk about is depression. Depression is a horrible thing, and for those people that haven't experienced it, it's really hard to experience. And so as far as depression goes, a lot of loved ones will try to help when people are depressed. They might say things like, suck it up. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't know how many times I heard that. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If I could, I would. They also may say things like, other people have it worse. And I know people are trying to help when they say those things, but really what I needed when I was depressed was somebody to say, would you like to go for a walk? Would you like to meet for coffee? And just listen. And maybe just say to me, I'm really sorry that you're going through this. And not give advice. And like I said, I know people are trying to help, but sometimes they just say the wrong things. The other thing I want to talk about is recovery. What does recovery mean? Well, I think recovery encompasses a lot of different things. It encompasses being on the right meds. It encompasses knowing your triggers and knowing what to do with them. It is being healthy and making wise decisions. But to me, a lot of recovery is accepting the fact that you have the illness, you accept the fact that it's not your fault, and you accept the fact that you want to move forward and do whatever you can to stay healthy. Just like a diabetic, they want to watch what they eat, they want to make sure they take their insulin, and they know what they need to do to be better. And I think that's what recovery is to me. Hope is possible, recovery is possible, never ever give up, and be kind to yourself.
Okay. Thoughts, comments, feedback?
At the hospital, we have a book. It actually was...
Closer to
Sorry, it was a plan that was developed by someone with mental illness. It's called Wellness Action Recovery Plan. We call it WRAP book. This plan, this booklet that we give to the patients, it's to help them identify triggers, help them developing a crisis prevention plan, who they will reach out to when they're in crisis mode, what medication has worked, or who we can call in case they are, they're having issues. As far as medication, just like he mentioned, he went on 14 different medications. Unfortunately, I've seen it happen where, it's kind of embarrassing to even say that, but the patient becomes kind of a guinea pig on the unit. You're trying meds after meds until you get the right combination to attack these negative and positive symptoms at the same time. We've had a girl one time, she didn't sleep for 10 days. So by the time she got on the unit, she's not sleeping, she's completely psychotic, undressing herself. I had to put her in seclusion, and I don't like putting people in seclusion because there's history of sexual trauma, any kinds of trauma related to seclusion. I don't want anybody in a locked, padded room, but that's what I had to do. Finally, I called a psychiatrist overnight. I said, I'm running out of options, because a lot of times something that we notice, even though there's Ativan, which is a sedative that we order for the patients, and Haldol, which is an antipsychotic, we would give these two medications together. However, Ativan tends to have a paradoxical effect on some of the patients, meaning instead of calming the patient down, it revs them up. So here am I having somebody 10 times psychotic on me now. So we're continuously giving her this medication, and she's not getting any better. So I called the psychiatrist. I said, I need something else. So we used Thorazine, which is a very old drug. I asked for it. The psychiatrist didn't want to give it to me. He said, this patient has been on this unit for 10 days. How come she's still not managed? I told him, I don't know, but right now, I can't have the rest of the unit being up. He reluctantly gave me the medication. The girl managed to sleep for 45 minutes in 10 days. Then after that, she was up. That night, I came back to work. She was a completely different person. Why? Her meds got changed. They completely removed her on what she was on, gave her something called gabapentin. They gave her Klonopin and put her on something else, and she was a completely different person. It was night and day. The person I left at 7:30 in the morning was completely different at 11 o'clock at night. So meds, it's trial and error. You never know. And your body can't even reject it. I mean, we've seen patients who've been on meds for like 20 years, and in the 21st year, it stopped working. Mm-hmm. So now these patients come in, and we have to figure out what to put them on. Mm-hmm. So it's managing somebody's mental illness is really not easy. There's side effects. They don't want to take it because the side effects are no joke. That's why anybody who's on Seroquel, who's on Depakote, who's on Abilify, we have to do something called metabolic screening, only because these people gain significant amount of weight in a short period of time that it can cause them to have diabetes, can cause them to have high cholesterol. So we have to monitor this every 3 months to check their blood level, check their waist measurement, check their height, to make sure that this person is not gaining so much weight to the point where the psych meds will stop working. Because once you have a metabolic syndrome, then it will be hard for you to manage the psychiatric symptoms.
So, some have criticized the whole medical model of psychiatric illness and have argued all we do is give them medicines. And you may hear that. And my defense to that is that's true to some extent, because that happens in any area, not just in psychiatry. We can say the same thing in infectious diseases. We give people antibiotics when they don't really need them. And sometimes it's because the patient demands it, because they can go down to the next doctor and he's going to give them anyways. But to get back to this point, from what you heard, sometimes it's not that the medicines don't work, it's just it's not working for you. And it may take a while to get the right medicines that would be the right ones for you. So don't give up on medicines right away. Also recognize that all medicines tend to have some kind of side effect. And some side effects are worse than others. But sometimes you're having to judge, is it worse to be thinking that there are voices in your head controlling you all the time, or is it bad to gain weight? And that's an individual decision you have to make with your physician. This young lady I told you about from our church early on, she gained a lot of weight. But once she was on the medication, she was no longer crawling under the bed saying that there were people there trying to shoot her. So it's a trade-off. And that's we live in an imperfect world. We have imperfect medicines, and this is what sometimes happens, unfortunately.
Doc, I would like to highlight what he said near the end that is a part of what we've been talking about. He emphasized how helpful it was when people listened to him. And I do think there's a tendency for us to think we're supposed to solve, think we need to cure. Earlier in the conversation, appropriately so, what else can I do? I want to make sure we're not minimizing the amazing contribution of just listening, being empathetic, caring. There is tremendous support that comes when individuals know you care.
Yeah, I love that. And to go back to the story of Job, that's another good example, you know. All he wanted was the friends to just sit and listen. Don't try to tell me anything. Just be here with me. I know you're with me. And there's tremendous healing power even in just being present.
I like to make the observation that mental illness in the church sometimes manifests itself in an obvious way, and we really don't think it's mental illness. So what do I mean by that? Look at brother X or sister X. Have you noticed when you say hi to them, they just look at you weird, and they're always mean and mean-spirited? Has anyone ever considered that it's because brother X or sister X has a low feeling all the time, a low-grade feeling all the time, and when he or she's home, he or she doesn't say a word to anybody, just in their little corner and get their little attitude? I'm saying that if a brother or a sister is here and feeling that low-grade feeling all the time, I'm saying to you, prayer hasn't yet worked for you. I am encouraging you to find a psychiatrist or some kind of psychotherapist, and they'll help you work through those issues. And as they help you work through those issues, and like David say, I'm going to praise the Lord anyhow. But I need to say that.
Oh, good point.
I'm sorry, brother, but in that instance, something that the church, like a lot of people don't know, is that there's countertransference. It's people responding to internal stimuli. If the person is sitting in a corner and the voices in their head are talking to them and you're coming and saying all kinds of stuff to them, they're not seeing you. You might think they're responding to you, but they're not responding to you. There's also countertransference. You might remind them of somebody who did something to them. It has nothing to do with you, but you remind them of someone who has been a source of extreme pain, a source of trauma for them. So the minute you come, okay, please step away. I really don't want to talk to you.
Right. I agree with you, sis. I agree with you. But I'm talking about a class of people like the elder who is so narcissistic that he won't hear what Sister Blue says because he's all about himself. I am saying, not just the elder, it could be the pastor, it could be anybody in the church who are full of themselves. And I'm saying, not everyone is sophisticated enough to know that some forms of mental illness. And I'm just putting it out there so that when we see it, we can say, maybe you need a little bit of counseling.
That's behavior. That's a learned behavior of somebody who's, thinking more of themselves. Paul says, please do not think of yourselves highly more than anybody else. Always think of somebody else. If someone thinks that they're high up there and you're down here, then that's not Christ-like behavior. There's no medication for that. Can't help yourself.
Well, there is medication for that. It's called Jesus' gift of salvation.
All right, yes. Oh, so just to kind of, okay, go back.
Question for the nurse.
Okay.
Now, how many of your patients walk into your office willingly and said, oh, I have a mental issue, I need help? Because I'm under the impression that these people, when they have mental issue or other issues, they're not admitting to it. They're saying, I don't have a problem. Because I know of someone who I know this person is taking the street marijuana. And when I talk to this person a couple of weeks ago, the person said, I'm God. How many of those people willingly come to you, or do you just see referrals?
We have two types of patients. We have voluntary patients. These are patients who went to the ER themselves because they weren't feeling well. They were thinking about hurting themselves or hurting anybody, hurting someone else or hearing voices. They willingly walked to the ER and asked to be admitted. We have other people that a family member requested a mobile outreach. They called the police because of extreme behavior, either destruction of property or violence against somebody, or like Dr. Greaves was saying, walking naked somewhere or doing something completely out of character. Those are involuntary patients. They get committed. They get screened by a clinician. The clinician examined the patient and says, yes, this patient meets criteria for involuntary commitment. Then we have 2 PCs, which is paperwork that 2 separate psychiatrists have to be done. All of this has to be done within 3 days, 72 hours, and then sent to a judge within that county to sign on the document to say, I am committing this patient on the unit. That patient, even if they wanted to leave within 48 hours, which the patient can for the voluntary, say, I want to leave within 48 hours, that patient cannot leave the hospital. Even if they wanted to leave, they can't, because the judge has signed on a paper to say this person is a danger to themselves and others, so they have to stay there. So 2 types, involuntary and voluntary. Or sometimes they become consensual. That's when the patient realizes that, okay, well, I do have a problem, but since you're saying I need treatment, I'll go. So they're somewhat consenting, but it's not fully a voluntary admission.
So I'll just add my perspective on this, Pat. As I showed you before, patients who have a psychotic problem, thought problems, they're the ones who have no insight that they're ill. They're the ones who will say, I'm God. You will not see them coming, very unlikely at least. The person who has a neurosis is more likely to go because they know there's something wrong they can't help doing. They know that they keep washing their hands all the time, 10 times, 20 times, they can't help themselves. They're the ones that are more likely to refer themselves to psychiatrists. I mean, that's just one example. And then they're the ones that you heard about. One of the problems that we find with treating patients with mental illness is that they often will stop taking their medication. And they will fool you. Even on the locked ward where I worked, we had a process where they will line up and come by, we'll give them their pills. We'll watch them take the pills. Even with our watching them, if you aren't careful, they will pretend to swallow it and don't swallow it. Next thing you find the pills down by their beds. So we would make them open their mouths, take a tongue depressor, go under their tongues to be sure they're taking their meds. And one of the problems with the same young lady I just mentioned that was in another church, she stopped taking her medication but was telling the parents that she was taking it, and she just decompensated. So it's a struggle. Even when you think they're getting better, and this was a person with a psychotic disorder, mind you, not a neurosis, they don't often have the insight to recognize that they're ill and they need to keep taking the medication. So that's the problem. Even in this church, as you know, we have a number of individuals right here. And, you know, they don't all take their medication. And so sometimes they end up in the hospital for a while, then they're back out. All right, we're going to take, sorry.
I'm sorry, I just had, thinking of your mental health, as someone who once considered to be a psychologist, changed my mind, because all of what we're talking about, I'd want to take everybody home with me. I ended up being a teacher and still wanted to take everybody home with me. Thinking of your mental health, how do you, after a day's work, deal with all of that you've dealt with? What do you do to bring yourself down from everything that you've dealt with throughout the day?
I read. I escape in fantasy books. That's my escape. As a matter of fact, when I'm not feeling well, I feel down on myself. The only place I feel comfortable is work. It's kind of weird to say that, but
That happens.
but that's the only place, like if I'm truly feeling like I'm not myself, like I go through manic phase with bursts of energy. I'm cleaning my house a lot and I'm consistently fixing things. And when I'm down, I'm down. But the only place I do actually feel comfortable is at work, because I use that negative energy to assist a patient, because we have all types of walks of patients. Recently, this young girl, I met her when she was 18. Now she's 24. And she came in, she said, Melissa, I can't do this anymore. You know, she has so many scars on her body from cutting herself, trying to kill herself. She said, I don't think I want to live anymore. And I asked her about, you know, her grandma, her brother. Those are deterrents we usually ask the patients about. And she said, I don't think I can do it anymore, because they used to keep me sane, but not anymore. They're not enough to keep me alive. So I said to her, we do self-disclosure, but it's extremely rare and it's not recommended because the patients can turn around and use that against you. I sat down in a corner with her and I started talking about God with her. Like, there are times we do have a chaplain, but there are times the Holy Spirit will prompt you to reach out to this person and say the exact words the person wants to hear. So I talked to her, I prayed with her. 2 days later, since I worked 12-hour shifts, I went back to work. She came to me, she said, do you know I had given up on Christ until I talked to you that day? She did not want to think about her relationship with God anymore because it was too hard for her. And the girl's been struggling for years because she's been in treatment since she was a teenager. I met her when she was 18, and now she's 24. So it's like, a lot of times, I go to work, I always say, God, I'm walking in, I don't know what you have in store for me, because I started working on a detox unit. It was mind-boggling to me to see people using substances and do certain things to use. But at the same time, I realized that Jesus died for these people. There's a reason why I'm in this field, and as a Haitian person, well, we don't believe in mental illness, period. No offense, but we don't. It's usually associated with witchcraft. Well, I will have to disagree because sometimes somebody is truly struggling. So for me, work is my escape. However, there are days that, especially if I work on a kids unit, it's hard for me. I have to sit in my driveway for some time before I walk inside my house to deal with my own family, because these are children, 6, 7-year-olds wanting to kill themselves. Like, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, and with these kids, I have to monitor how I interact with them, because a lot of them have history of trauma, especially sexual and physical trauma, so any slightest touch towards them can trigger them. So these are tough times for me only when I work on a kids unit. On an adult unit, well, I've dealt with people trying to cut off their body parts, taking out their eyeballs, the voice is telling them to do that. That I can't handle.
Yeah. So I'm going to give a chance for last few comments. There are 2 more slides which I won't show. One is on spiritual help for mental health. There are a whole list of things and verses. If you want to get them, you can get them from us, from the slide set, if you want a slide set, and another slide of resources that you can call for suicide and so on. But I do want to give a chance to, if you have any last questions, otherwise I'm going to ask to see if Carlene has any last points she wants to say, or Melissa, or the pastor, if there's nobody in the audience. I also want to send a shout out to you, Sergine. Thanks for coming. Last questions? Okay, your turn.
I just want to affirm what I heard, and I think I understood it. You mentioned life groups, and I think that's an
Guys, can you put the
excellent...
next slide up? Sorry. Go
I
ahead.
think that's an excellent move for our churches to try to become more relational. The zenith...
Next slide, sorry. Hang on. Good, leave that there. Go ahead.
The zenith of church experience was in Acts chapter 2 after the day of Pentecost, and the description of the believers was that they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship. It wasn't just a teaching, there was a community koinonia, they call it. And I'm excited to hear that the church is moving in the direction of these more relational groups to provide support for individuals that may have these kinds of challenges.
I actually took a training 2 days ago. It was brought to my attention that you don't have to be a clinician to even perform that assessment. It's called Columbia Suicide Risk Assessment. It's a free training online. I was trying to get the website here to give to Dr. Greaves, and once I get it, I'll give it to him. But any one of you can go online and do that, and this is to help you identify people who are at risk for suicide. It's specific questions that you ask, because when you ask the person, oh, do you want to hurt yourself, they'll respond to you, but then you need to go more in depth about it, and it's completely a free training. You go online, Pastor, you can, as soon as I get the information, it's something anybody can do it. Like, you really don't have to be a clinician or work in mental illness, mental health care setting. You can just take the training and it print out your certificate or go over it as much as you want, but it provides like tremendous, like wealth of information about how to assist people and how to refer them to the necessary care facilities. And also, if you have issues with medication, there are Christian centers in New Jersey. There's one in Wyckoff, I forgot what's it called. They don't use meds, from my understanding, when it comes to treating certain disorders, whether it's addiction or a mental illness. They don't use medication. They mainly use like psychotherapy. It's in Wyckoff. If you know of anybody who's a little afraid to take medication, you can refer them to that center. Just Google Christian Center in Wyckoff, New Jersey.
And if you send me the suicide online URL, I'll share it with the group. And I want to thank you, Melissa, so much for agreeing to participate in this and being vulnerable and sharing your own experience. And for you, Pastor Fordham, for being willing to participate in this. I know that this wasn't exactly the reason why you came to Oranges, but we kind of drafted you in this, and it was good to have your perspective and your experience, so I appreciate that as well. And for all those of you who participated, we're glad that you're here and you participated. I hope you found it helpful, useful, and I want to leave you with this quotation, the last bullet from Mrs. White's writings, Ministry of Healing. This is so important. The first phrase, practice gratitude. Practice gratitude. Nothing tends more to promote health of body and soul than does a spirit of gratitude and praise. And she goes on to say, it is a positive duty to resist melancholy, discontented thoughts and feelings. And get this, as much a duty as it is to pray. Let that sink in and permeate your thoughts as you leave our session. So, thank you all very much again, and I'm turning back over now to our education leader, Elder Marth.
Obviously, there's so much more to talk about. This is such a rich topic that it seems as though we could be here for another hour. But we have to end this. Someone whispered in my ears that maybe we should do this at the 12 o'clock hour, because there are so many people that need to hear more about this, that we need to talk about this, and we need to look at ways to help one another. We know that we're struggling with the life groups here, but we heard this is a strategy. It is a strategy, really, to establish this meaningful relationship that will help us to connect with one another and move forward. So on that note, I want to thank Dr. Greaves for being so willing to take on whatever I throw at him, really. But he took on that project and that topic. We want to thank you, my dear sister, for being here, for coming with us. And if you're looking for a church home, we are here. We are here, 270 Reynolds Terrace. 270 Reynolds Terrace in Orange. And Pastor Fordham, thank you very, 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 very much. Come on, put your hands together. Came all the way from Tennessee. Pastor Stoddard told me he traded places with him. But we'll let him know that we are very grateful that you've consented to come and spend that weekend with us. And we'll pray for traveling mercies as you're returning home. So I will ask you to please stand. We're going to sing together, side by side we stand, awaiting God's coming. And Pastor Fordham will then say the closing prayer for us.
Anybody can play? No players? Okay. All right.
We do. I know somebody who can play. Fedi, could you? He's my brother, so I can do that to him.
Side by side we stand, awaiting God's command, worshiping the saving King. He can bring it up. Living by His grace and moving on His faith, Jesus Himself will see us through. Meet me in heaven, we'll join hands together. Meet me by the Savior's side. I'll meet you in heaven, we'll sing songs together. Brothers and sisters, I'll be there. Soldiers, okay, to go where Jesus fight the foe, and we shall overcome. Now it's too low. Heaven is our goal, and saving every soul, that we all will be there. I'll meet you in heaven, we'll join hands together. Meet you by the Savior's side. I'll meet you in heaven, we'll sing songs together. Brothers and sisters, I'll be there. Pray that we all Pray that we all will be there.
Let's bow our heads together. Dear Heavenly Father, we are thankful that you have made us a church family to provide us with support and encouragement as we walk along this challenging journey. Father, you describe the church as a body. I ask that as the head, you will communicate to us our assignments. Give us your spirit so that we might sense when another part of the body needs to be encouraged or strengthened. And I pray that we would encourage one another and build each other up as you encourage us to do so in the Word. Now, thank you for this time that we've spent, and allow us to be better for it. Keep us until we meet again. And if we do not meet again here, allow us to meet again in heaven. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.